So let's talk about how the fearful avoidant attachment style often reacts to a breakup. And we'll also talk at a high level about what to do if you're trying to win them back. And then maybe we'll do a part two video to dive into that in a little bit more detail. If you're not familiar with attachment styles, the fearful avoidant attachment style is kind of the hot and cold partner in relationships, and they often can give mixed messages and sort of be like all in or all out. They can kind of operate in more extremes when it comes to love and relationships and commitment. And they tend to be really emotionally available, really kind, very present, very caring and empathetic. But they also tend to be afraid because they have a lot of kind of chaos in their upbringing the vast majority of the time. And it can cause them to have a lot of mixed emotions and feelings about deep commitment, about vulnerability, and about closeness. And so when a fearful avoidant attachment style goes through a breakup, what ends up happening first is they try to suppress their own emotions. And what we'll generally see for the fearful avoidant attachment style is when there's a breakup, they go into kind of this like deep coping sort of stage first. And the deep coping stage tends to last as a general rule for the first 3, sometimes 4 weeks. And what we'll see in that coping is it's kind of like their numbing stage. Fearful avoidants generally do not get a lot of good, healthy emotional modeling for how to process their emotions, how to talk about their feelings. And they tend to be really good at getting other people to talk and about being there for other people when it comes to those things. But it's almost like they don't often take their own advice and have this great capacity to really be there and be present with themselves. And so what we'll see instead is they tend to go into this like high intensity coping stage when they first come out of a breakup. And that can look like numbing through going out all the time and drinking a lot. It can look like numbing through like binge watching television all the time, every night. It can look like numbing through binge eating food. There can be all sorts of different like coping mechanisms that fearful avoidants tend to have. But generally, when they go through a breakup, they will go into sort of the more high intensity version. For some fearful avoidants, it's like extreme bouts of exercise or extreme bouts of like social commitments. But we'll generally see first that the fearful avoidant goes into this kind of hyper coping state when they first go through a breakup. And they won't show that to their ex. They won't like make that clear or apparent. They will just behave that way as a general rule. Then the second thing that tends to happen after that 3 to 4 weeks where they start kind of coming out and starting to feel more of their feelings. And sometimes that they start doing that as late as like the 6-week mark. But then they'll start basically repressing their feelings in a more like intermittent way. So around that 3 to 6 week mark, give or take, and obviously that depends on different circumstances of the breakup, like how long were you dating? Were you living together? How did you break up? Like what was the breakup all about? What did it represent? Generally what we'll see is that around that 3 to 6 week mark, they'll kind of like start feeling their feelings intermittently. And it's funny because a lot of fearful avoidance have told me over the years things like, oh, I didn't even realize I was upset by the breakup until later on. I didn't even realize that I was being affected until I recognized that my behaviors were not normal. And this tends to be the most common manifestation for a fearful avoidant. It's not like they will like really allow themselves to feel a lot of their deep feelings around connection and vulnerability and closeness. They'll instead tend to have these kind of extended periods where they feel their emotions much later, or you can just see that they're not themselves in their behaviors. And so again, like maybe you have a fearful avoidant friend or a loved one or ex, and maybe you see that like suddenly they're working out 2 or 3 times a day. And you're like, hey, you didn't used to do that. Like that's extreme coping. Or maybe you see that they suddenly are going out 5 or 6 nights a week. And you're sort of like, hey, like it seems like they're just over distracting themselves instead of actually processing the experience. And it doesn't mean don't go out after a breakup or things like that, but it means when we're operating more in extremes, it can even be like extreme withdrawing from everybody in the world and kind of disconnecting and withdrawing into creature comforts like food or television or social media or whatever it might be. But generally we'll see these different dynamics. Now in that same space, okay, in the 3 to 6 weeks, generally, you won't see a lot of this until about the 5 or 6 week mark, but sometimes as well, fearful avoidants can go into rebound mode. And fearful avoidants are an attachment style that tend to rebound, sometimes more than other attachment styles by a little bit, but it's generally because they don't want to sit with themselves and their feelings, and they're kind of looking to get their needs met that were filled by the partner or their ex. And generally, fearful avoidance, and I've had a lot of conversations with people over the years, in the short period of time that they are rebounding, they often won't realize that it's a rebound. Often they'll be like, okay, I'm just in this space and, I'm rebounding because I'm interested in somebody else. I'm not actually like treating this as a rebound. But as time goes on, often what we'll also see is that the fearful avoidant will kind of look back and be like, oh, that was a rebound. Or it'll be like a shorter relationship that they go into that they kind of sabotage quickly or soon later on. And it's not every fearful avoidant always does this. But these are some common like outputs of a fearful avoidant going through a breakup that I've seen. And I want to make it really clear that when a fearful avoidant rebounds, it's a little bit different than when an AP or a DA does this. Generally, for the fearful avoidant, the rebound relationship isn't very likely to last. It can, of course, there are exceptions and wild cards, but as a definite overarching pattern, it tends to be kind of a short-lived thing for a lot of fearful avoidance. And it's usually because they're just trying to kind of process their emotions. And the more time and space they have, the more they realize that it's almost like they take some of the chaos from the past relationship and they tend to kind of bring it into the next one. And it has a shorter sort of lifespan because of that as a general rule. So what do you do? If you are the loved one, first of all, if you're the fearful avoidant listening to this, you should know that like all of these things just represent that it's really important for you as a fearful avoidant to get good at dealing with pain, because pain's this really natural part of life. And our emotions are when we're in resistance to our emotions, that's where everything feels so scary and magnified. I always tell this story inside PDS, like inside the school when I do the webinars each week. And I always talk about how when I was a little kid, I used to be like convinced that there was a monster under my bed. Like I truly thought like there's a friggin' monster under that bed. And when I was a kid, so let's say I was like 5 years old, I would go running to my bed and I would jump over it in case the monster was going to try to grab my legs. And that was like my thing in my head. Like I thought that, and I did that for like every single day, every time I would get into bed for years. And then eventually I just got the strength one day, probably when I turned like 7, I was probably 7, 8 years old, to just look under the bed. And when I looked under the bed, I was like, okay, there's no monster. And then instead of jumping over the bed, I would just start looking under the bed each time I went to get in bed. And then eventually I just like was over it. I didn't believe in the monster under the bed anymore. And I would say that for fearful avoidance, we tend to, because I was a fearful avoidant for a very long time, we tend to have that kind of relationship to our emotions. We tend to feel like our emotions are this big, scary thing, and we'll do everything we can to avoid them and distract ourselves from them and get away from them. And when you actually learn to sit with yourself and process your emotions and just tune into what you're feeling and what you actually need, and, recognize some of those different fears that are there and challenge some of the ideas that are causing those fears, right? Scary ideas like I can never trust somebody, or somebody will always betray me, or relationships will never last, like these ideas that cause us suffering. When we tune into ourselves, first of all, you'll see that emotions are just sensations in your body. Like they can't ever actually harm you. They're only just giving you feedback. The real harm comes into from emotions when we avoid them and we're so scared of just feeling that we'll do these really chaotic things to avoid feeling something, right? We'll use the substances or alcohol or binge eat food, all as a means of just not feeling the sensations in your body. And so, it's the monster under the bed. It really is. It's like, hey, you're just experiencing sensations in your body. Like there's nothing really to run from. And so when fearful avoidants get good at sitting with their emotions, a lot of the unhealthy coping mechanisms will start to melt away. So, I kind of went down a rabbit hole there, but I just wanted to say, if you are a fearful avoidant, it's just because there's these painful dynamics kind of beneath the surface, that you have these unhealthy coping mechanisms. Like that's the reason why. It's not a reflection of like who you are or, something bad. It's just the way that you're coping that can be much easier than it is. So anyways, on a separate note, if you want to do a deep dive into that kind of thing as a fearful avoidant, you can go through the Somatic processing course. It teaches you how to actually process your emotions in a healthy way. And you can check it out for free for 7 days. And if you're going through a breakup in this, and you're wanting to work through this, we have a How to Heal from a Breakup course that will take that immediate sting out of the breakup and help you just have clarity and like a breakthrough in terms of what to do next and what your next steps can be and just a positive direction forward. Anyways, you can check out either of those for 7 days for free. Both of them are more, like you can seriously, if you have like 3 hours of time, you can get through both of them within 7 days, like 3 hours across the week. Like there's a lot in there. But they're only like an hour and a half long each. So more than enough time to get through that stuff. Anyways, so going into the kind of second part of this video, and I'll put the link below, is what do you do if you're the fearful avoidant partner or the loved one of a fearful avoidant and you're trying to reconnect with them and you're like wanting to get back together? And I want to just touch on this at a high level, and we'll definitely save this for like a part two, or we'll go into this in more detail. But here's a few things you need to know. If you're trying to get back together with anybody, irrespective of what your attachment style is, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're not just getting back into the same patterns. You need to make sure that there's a conversation where you're very intentional and clear ahead of time about like what your boundaries are, what your non-negotiables are, what wasn't working the first time around, and like what you will do differently this time around collectively, both of you, right? And there needs to be a really vulnerable conversation. One thing I've seen a lot over the years is that people don't have those vulnerable conversations. And so what ends up happening instead is they get into these dynamics where they just say, "Oh, I miss you too." And they get back together and then they just repeat the same patterns and then it just ends again. And this time with more resentment and more frustration and more anger. So we have to break up the patterns. We have to be conscious and intentional about how we're approaching these things. And that means each party being able to talk about what wasn't working and what we need to fix this time around, what those boundaries, what those standards are, those non-negotiables. And then we have to set a deadline around how long we participate in the rekindling phase, because when we're trying to get back together, another thing I've seen over the years is that people will just stay trying to make it work with somebody from their past for like years. And you can't stay in the gray area forever. It's not healthy and it doesn't feel good. So having a deadline, hey, I'm really going to try to make this work for 6 weeks. And I'm going to see if the needle moves. And I'm going to see if this person jumps on board with me and also puts in new effort and tries these different things so that we can meet our different needs and have healthier boundaries and have these better standards for how we're going to function within the relationship. And if we don't do those things, it tends to, again, just like lead to more chaos and more frustration long term. So what I'm going to do here now is, because there are certain tools to like how to rekindle with the fearful avoidant, things that they need as well. And I'm going to save that for a part two, because I know this is already kind of a lengthy video. So stay tuned for part two. We'll talk about like some important things that fearful avoidants respond to when rekindling in a little more nuanced detail. And you'll probably see that come out very shortly. And then if you want to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss anything at all, then I would love to have you here as a part of the community. I put daily breakthrough videos out here all about attachment styles, relationships, the subconscious mind. And I really appreciate you being here today to watch. And if you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in future videos.